Welcome to Charity Village Connects. We're pleased to welcome Mark Blumberg as our guest today. Mark is a partner at the law firm Blumberg Segal LLP in Toronto and works almost exclusively advising nonprofits and registered charities on their work in Canada and abroad. Welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mary, for having me.
I wanted to start by really starting at the basics and getting your overview, your thoughts on the use of alternative forms of revenue for nonprofits and charities, such as social enterprise, social finance, impact investing, and other kinds of revenue generating tools or instruments from a legal perspective. Do you have any concerns or what are your observations from the work that you do?
Well, I guess I would start with that many charities are doing things that could be considered social enterprise, etc. In fact, more money is brought in from earned revenue than is from fundraising. So some people make it out like this is something that is a new thing in the last few years or something, but it's been happening for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years. So it's not really new. Essentially, anything can be done. It's just a question of which vehicle can do it. And so if you're a charity, you get lots of advantages of being a charity, but there are also some restrictions. And so just about anything can be done, but it might not be the charity can do it, but it might be a wholly owned subsidiary, or it might be a nonprofit. It might be an affiliated entity in some sort. So lots can be done. The question sometimes is that just like getting charitable status, people think is, oh, if I get that, I'm going to all of a sudden be bringing in millions of dollars. They have this fervent idea that this is, going to be easy and all that. It's not so much. In fact, what we've seen is that charities, for example, in the UK that rely heavily on social enterprise during COVID were hit the hardest. So, they say 9 out of 10 small businesses fail. Charities have some advantages over entrepreneurs, but they also have some disadvantages. And many social enterprises and other types of interesting and innovative things actually fail. Some charities aren't even aware they failed because they're not fully keeping shall we say, tabs on the full cost and all that of the effort. So it's definitely something good if you're trying to diversify your revenue, but there are huge risks associated with it. And when also before, especially if it's a big social enterprise, really make sure from a legal point of view that it's okay, because it's one thing to try something out that's small and doesn't cost much and you give it up. What do they say? Fail fast or something. If you're going to fail, then have it be fast and not expensive. But if you invest a lot in something and then you do your research as to what a charity can do and you realize you can't do it, then this is less than ideal. But lots of things that can be done. I think that, if you look at the numbers, the charity sector takes in almost $300 billion a year. And so I think that government money is about, it's about 60% of that. It's a lot of money from government. There's money from fundraising. There's money from business activities. I'm not thinking that this is going to be a replacement for some of the other major funding sources, but it could be very helpful. And it's not just about bringing in money. Often some of these social enterprises and other things could be about also helping people and maybe meeting a need in a community or something like that.
So you mentioned the risks. What are those risks? Maybe you could explain or give an example of what the risks might be for an organization that perhaps hadn't explored this and is thinking about doing it.
The biggest risk when you're doing a social enterprise is the same risk when you're just running a business in the normal course, which is that you might put a lot of effort, a lot of capital into it, and you fail. That's the biggest risk, I would say. The next thing is if you're running it through a charity, and as I said before, you don't need to run it through a charity. Sometimes it can be run through a for-profit that's owned by the charity. But you get into charity regulatory things. There are rules around what sort of social enterprises, and even the word social enterprise is not a charity law word. So, what are you actually doing, and is it a related business or not? If it got really big, it might be that it isn't any longer a related business, or if it's not related to your objects. So you need to look at your objects and work out what they are. In some cases, you may need to expand your objects to be able to do the social enterprise that you want to do. So the main risks I would see as the risk of it not achieving what you want, either in terms of resources or other benefits that you see. And then the secondary risk would be the legal compliance type risks that one can have. But also being a charity is very competitive, right? Lots of charities, especially in some areas. But being a business in some areas can also be very competitive as well. So I just think that one has to have a balanced view. Tremendous risk, but it can be very good for a charity to have a social enterprise.
So, how easy or complicated does the current legal framework make it for organizations who want to engage in these kinds of activities? You've obviously indicated that it's not something that organizations should jump into without some preparation. But what are the sort of frameworks in place currently that allow for a charitable organization, for example, to be part of a or start a social enterprise, for example?
Right. So the first thing is I suggest that the words social enterprise, for example, not be used. Okay, that would be my first thing because I think it's confusing. You need to just break apart what exactly do you want to do, because many things that people call a social enterprise, it's actually a charitable activity. It's not even a business activity. It's a charitable activity where you're charging. So that's the first thing, is to actually work out what is it you want to do and take out all the lingo that isn't helpful in a way to trying to ascertain what you're trying to do, right? And then the second thing would be there are rules, related business rules. It isn't helpful that the guidance hasn't been updated in almost 20 years by CRA, but it is what it is. And there's a lot you can do in there. As I said, more money is raised through earned income than through fundraising. So I think people don't realize the huge amounts of money that are potentially out there, in certain ways where groups are charging for business activities and things like that. So it's very doable. But as I said, charities being like a special purpose vehicle where huge incentives are given, far more than in typical countries. In Canada they're given huge incentives. It's never going to be that a charity will just be able to compete on a quote unquote even playing field, unless of course the government got rid of the non-tax. Right now tax, you don't pay taxes if you're a charity, and you get to issue official donation receipts. Unless that is gotten rid of, it'll never be a playing field that's fair for businesses. And so basically there's always going to be special rules for charities, but you can get around that in a sense by just not having the charity do the social enterprise, have a separate entity. But the key thing to avoid the issues of the charity scandal is basically, I would say, have it be 100% owned by the charity. So if the thing is very successful, it's the charity that gets the benefit of it, the equity and all that other stuff. Okay. But you can do, like I said, almost anything. It's only a question of, can it be done in a charity? Does it need to be done in a for-profit? Can it be done in a non-profit? It depends on the nature of the activity and whether you think it's going to be profitable. Because some things that are social enterprise, if you can even break even, that is tremendous. And you could be doing wonderful work, and then it could even be run as a non-profit. It doesn't have to be a for-profit or anything of the sort, right? So I think what I would say is there are some lawyers and consultants who deal with these types of issues, and people should just really think carefully about it, especially if it involves a large investment of money.
I'd like to get your impressions, your thoughts around what is being called impact investing. And this is something new. This concept is new to me because, of course, I think of investing in for-profit corporations as obviously you're looking for a financial return, and
Mhm.
this term impact investing is still sort of opaque to me. Can you explain what you understand it to be, and just how it can be utilized by charities or nonprofits as a potential diversification of their revenues?
Yeah, I mean, if you have money to invest, if you go back 40 years ago, it might have been thinking of what's the maximum return, and that's all we cared about. Okay. Then you had movements to, well, but we don't want to invest in arms, or we don't want to invest in this or that, some sort of negative screen. And then you move to a more positive thing and all that. Impact investing, I mean, I think the concept's been around for a long time, but the terminology seems to every 2 to 4 years change. And to be frank, I'm a little bit cynical sometimes, because I look at some people who say, "Oh yeah, we're impact investing," and it's not really that different than normal investing. It's such a broad term that it doesn't really mean that much in my mind. But if it means that you want to really align your values with the investing you do, then I'm all for that. I think that's great. Um, but the terminology itself I find to be not always reflective of the reality. And so yeah, I think that I would say that at a minimum you need to do some sort of screening of what you're investing in. But whether it's going to be fully aligned or not is a different question. And charities, the other thing to keep in mind is there's investing, where there's all sorts of rules, federal rules and provincial rules around how a charity can invest. But there are also something called program related investments, which are not really investments. They have different rules, and they're more like giving money to a group where you have some direction and control, and there's some tight requirements, but you don't have the normal return expectations. Okay. And so that is another thing, and it's almost like a different category. And even though it has the word investing in it, it's not really investing. So one has to really work through the, shall we say, the legal concepts that would apply to a charity. But a lot of what is talked about in terms of impact investing is very doable in the charity sector. But there are limits, like you're supposed to have a diversified portfolio. So you can't just take 10 million, say you have 10 million to invest. You can't just take 10 million and put it into one company because you care about the environment and green energy and all that other stuff. Okay. So there's limits on what a charity can do. But otherwise, impact investing is something that I think people are talking a lot about.
Yes, I've heard a lot about it recently, and I appreciate your comments because I'm still not clear on what that actually means, and I think what you're saying is it can mean a lot of different things, and that's the problem with the term, that it's so general, and it's used in a way that may suggest something that's not actually true in terms of where the funds are actually being utilized or invested in. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a newish term, I think, that is being used, and I think the general approach makes sense, and it's something that charities should be aware of. However, I'm just it's one of these things where. If you have 100 investment advisors and they're talking about this, there might be 50 different ideas as to what it means. It certainly isn't completely clear as to what it is, but that's just my impression of it, and different people are using it. So I would say that yes, the idea sounds good. What is actually happening right now? We have about $120 billion or something sitting in private and public foundations being invested. Now, if you ask me, that's a bit of a travesty that so much money is sitting on the sidelines, basically, that when we have, COVID and all these other problems. But certainly, there's no question that even if it's not 120, there's going to be some large amount of money that charities are going to have to invest because they need to have reserves and things like that, especially operating charities. And I would prefer that they invested in appropriate things, not just from a legal point of view, but also from an ethical point of view. So hopefully, yes, people will think about impact investing and how does it align with their objects and what they're trying to accomplish. So I'm all for that. It's just like, sometimes corporate social responsibility can be more like greenwashing or whitewashing or whatever it is. So impact investing is a nice talk. Many foundations that have a lot of money should be talking less about how they invest it and more about how do we get money out the door to charities that actually need it, especially at times like COVID. So it's a balanced conversation. I think you have to think of both things. Okay.
Well, speaking of COVID, the pandemic certainly seemed to highlight some of the challenges that charities face and nonprofits with regards to building infrastructure or to embrace digitization that was needed when everyone pivoted and had to work remotely or provide their services remotely. And that was because of limitations on how their revenues can be used. What are your thoughts about these laws? And do you believe that nonprofit and charitable sector really needs new flexibility in the regulatory legislation to allow it to embrace new tools and revenue generating instruments? Or, this certainly seems to have highlighted a problem in the sector. What are your thoughts about that?
I guess it might be a minority view that I have. So the first one is I think charities did an excellent job of pivoting, as they say, the overused word, during the changes that took place. A lot of it had to do with, although charities don't have a lot of money sometimes when it comes to things like administration and management and IT and things like that, they managed to actually do a tremendous job of changing how they operate, delivering services differently, and all that. I think I saw more changes in a matter of months than I saw in 20 years. So I think charities did a great job. I think some lawyers maybe think that the rules are a problem. I am not sure that the rules are a problem. I have asked CRA to do a guidance on, as they have with fundraising, to do a guidance on administration, because in fact, for a little charity, the main administrative burden for some small charities are either corporate or CRA. So I would like CRA to say, and this is a document that the public can read, that it's important that charities have good books and records, good systems, internal controls, all this stuff. And I want a guidance on that. I think that would be very helpful. But the fact is, we know that charities are allowed to spend a reasonable amount on admin. And that could be for some really super simple charities, it could be a few percent. But for some very complicated universities or hospitals, it could be 20%, 25%, and we're talking, some of these groups have, we're talking then hundreds of millions of dollars on admin. We're not talking small amounts of money. So with a $300 billion total size of the charity sector, I know we sometimes think of it as a poor sector and every group is small, but a lot of groups are small. About a third are under 50,000. But there's a lot of money also in the charity sector. So it's not all poverty there. And basically, I think charities are allowed to spend reasonable amounts. I think a lot of the problem is donors and others who maybe don't understand the importance of administration and having capacity within your organization and having some duplication. So if one system fails, you've got another system. In other words, the cheapest path is cheap, but it's risky sometimes. But I think this is, I don't see it as mainly a legislative issue or a legal issue. I think it's mainly an attitudinal issue that, for example, if I saw an international development charity spending, say, less than 5 or 10% on admin, I probably wouldn't donate to them unless I knew them very well and had lots of information on what they're doing, because I just don't understand how you can do it. Okay. At least, CRA recently revoked a charity that spent 200 million outside the country over 4 years. They had 4,000 projects and they had one part-time person taking care of everything. If that's how you want your money spent, then go to a low admin charity, and eventually it'll get revoked by CRA because it's not actually doing the stuff that it's supposed to do. That's a problem. So I think that the problem is more attitudinal and people worrying in the charity sector that others will criticize them because maybe they have some money spent on it. But I think that also comes down to making sure you've got a good board with people who understand the importance of having this infrastructure within the organization. So yeah, I'm not sure that it's necessary to change the law. I have heard people, I'll tell you what the problem is. If we say a charity can spend as much as it wants on administration, how are you going to feel when they spend 60% on administration and 35% on fundraising and they only spend 5% on charitable activities? You're not going to be happy with that. But if we don't measure it, and we don't have some limits, and the limits are really, it should be what's reasonable, as I say, reasonable, necessary, and proportionate. And when you're buying things, it shouldn't be more than fair market value. Unless we have some baseline rules, it will be the 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 who take advantage of it and basically say, oh, well, we can spend anything we want on it. So I think there has to be some limits, but it'll vary tremendously depending on the nature of the organization and its activities. If you're dealing with vulnerable adults and children, you need to have all sorts of safeguarding and other procedures in place. It's a good investment and ethically absolutely necessary. And that costs money. And that's, going to be something that might be administrative a cost as opposed to necessarily a program cost. It depends on how it's how it's structured. Okay.
That's really fascinating because there is such pressure, I think, on a lot of charities to have that administrative line item be, lower as a sort of almost a credibility factor in terms of what their mission statement is and that they're fulfilling that relative to just, building up their own admin and paying themselves. So I do think that that's a really astute observation and one that obviously highlights, an actual must be a challenge for a lot of leaders of charities um, to walk that tightrope in a way in ensuring that they have sufficient um, admin revenues dedicated to admin, and at the same time keep the number down low enough to have the credibility and the public trust.
Yeah, and I would say so. Having low admin actually, like I said, I think can actually create problems for you because people will be wondering what's going on. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not possible because you might just have some generous for-profit company who just pays for everything on the side. And we do see some foundations, for example, giving away money who have no admin costs. How can they do it? Well, because someone pays for it. It's not magic, right? But if you're a self-sustaining organization and you're not covering off the things, because we know you can save money on admin by getting rid of financial controls and by just having less finance staff and not getting accounting help and not doing an audit and not there's lots of ways you can, by not being transparent, not worrying about putting up stuff on a website, you can be so you can save some money, but then there's huge costs down the road. What I would say is a couple points. One is this relates also to the reserve fund. Every charity that has ongoing costs needs to have a reserve. Many charities were really tested during COVID, and we're lucky that people were generous and governments were generous and everything else. But many charities were not prepared for COVID in terms of they had almost no reserve fund. And as a result, if it wasn't for all this stuff that we can't rely on reliably to be there, they would have just gone under. So having a reserve, so it's not only should we invest in admin and some of the things needed there, the finance and all that stuff, but also to make sure at the same time that we have enough kept back, because on the one hand, charities want to help their beneficiaries and spend everything on the beneficiaries that they can, right? They really want to move the money out the door, but they've got to hold back some so that they have 1, 2, 3 months or 6 months, depending on the organization, maybe even more, basically reserve and that sort of thing. And the other thing I would just point out, which is a little surprise to me, but last year in the budget, they actually said that if you deliberately make, you put stuff on your T3010 and it's not correct, that your charity on that alone can be revoked. They don't need another reason. Okay, now charities are making often mistakes. We review hundreds of T3010s. 90% of them, there's mistakes on them. So there's lots of mistakes made. That's not deliberate necessarily, but you can be suspended if it's not deliberate, which means you can't issue receipts for you. That's bad and it's public. But even worse now, if you're deliberately like making it look like your fundraising or admin is lower than it is, CRA on that alone can revoke you. So I would encourage groups to actually try to get the numbers to be as good as possible, right, correct, if you will, and also to invest where necessary. You want to be concerned with the long-term survival of the organization. You also want to be thinking about your beneficiaries. When an organization shuts down, sometimes that can result in a lot of beneficiaries suffering. So it's not always in the best interest of the beneficiaries to have no reserve and not have proper administrative processes and things like that. Okay.
Well, again, this was a story that really fascinated me, and it certainly is reflective of some of the issues that we've been talking about here today. You've written extensively about the We Charity scandal, and in fact, you testified to the Standing Committee back in December 2020. Can you tell us about what your first thoughts were when the story broke, and how that evolved over the course of 2020 as the various sort of details kind of trickled out? And flooded out in some instances. Maybe you could just give us from your perspective on this.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's hard to remember back. It's a long time ago, right? But I think my initial thing was I couldn't believe that the Liberal government did this. Like, it was so stupid what they did. I couldn't believe it. There were so many problems with this, and deciding to give so much money to one particular charity, that there were lots of questions floating around about this charity, was just monumental mistake. And you have to understand, I try to stay away from partisan politics and stuff. I think the Liberals have done many great things. In fact, most of the things done during the whole COVID crisis are good. And I think that between SNC-Lavalin and the We thing, these are probably two of the worst things, but maybe there's some other things, in terms of some things that they're not doing or should be doing or whatever. But these are really, really bad things. So I thought it was really bad. I was in shock basically for a few days. Just I couldn't believe it. Like, this is crazy. I would say that in the beginning, there were a few people, maybe 5 or 10 people within the charity sector, mainly BIPOC people, who actually were the ones who said something. And that was fantastic that they were prepared to jump up publicly, say something about this, because honestly, in Canada, if you want to criticize Stephen Harper or whatever, no problem. You want to criticize certain people, within the charity sector, it's not a problem. but they're in whole areas where you have to be super careful, or I shouldn't say have to be careful. Canadians are not prepared to say anything about it when it comes to issues like granting and foundations and all this, and government agencies that could give you a lot of money or not give you a lot of money. We don't live in a free society when it comes to charities and that. It's very sad. So those people who stood up at the beginning, really, that was courageous of them to do. Because now in hindsight, we know, oh yeah, everyone had a problem with it, and they canceled it very quickly because it was just such a tremendous mistake. But it raised bigger issues that I think are worse than the issues relating to charity regulation and all this. It relates to how can a government department, and some people are saying this should be the government department that represents the whole charity sector instead of CRA. How can a government department make such a bad mistake? That is something that I still don't know the answer to, how they could ever get there. I was thinking it was sort of like a corruption issue with, Bill Morneau and all that, and he's buddies with these guys, and then he resigns and all that. But I heard from other people in the charity sector that this is a lot more than a Bill Morneau issue. This is an issue of a government department having not doing due diligence and having very strong ideas about what's right or wrong, but not doing basic due diligence. And I, in fairness to government people, they don't run charities. They often don't understand how charities even work. But you would think that they could develop the competency if it's important to them. And this government department that gives out so much money, that's very worrisome. So that, if anything, was a big picture, one of the biggest issues. And then the other thing I would just say is, $400 million was donated to We over, say, 20 or 25 years, whatever the case may be. It's a lot of money. And so it's not a question of does We do good? It's did they do $400 million worth of good? That's really, I think, more the issue. But even more than that, there are other issues. There's other groups that no one even knows about that are blowing 200 million here and there. And so I was thinking it's a good thing that the reporters are covering this part of this problem, if you will. But now I've gotten to the point where I'm like, there are so many other issues as well. So We had lots of problems, but there are other groups that there is almost no visibility to that have lots of problems. And we have very little transparency in the charity sector. So I sort of want to move away from the We story. I think that and I've written, as you said, Mary, quite extensively on some of the lessons learned. And I also think a lot of groups learn the wrong lessons from a scandal. So I've seen people say, "Oh, you know what the lesson of We was you can't have more than one entity. You can only have a charity, and you shouldn't have a for-profit, or you shouldn't have this." No, We had, I think in the end, I don't know if it was 20 or 30 or 40 different entities. The chair of We didn't even know about half the entities. Yeah, that's a problem. But if you're a charity and you want to do some sort of business activity that doesn't fit within the definition that CRA has of related business, then I would say set up a for-profit and you can do it. If you want to have a nonprofit that can do all sorts of things where, you don't have charity regulation. Now, you can't just take money from the charity and put it in the nonprofit and then it's no longer charitable money. But a lot of money doesn't need to go into the charity. A government agency can give the money to the nonprofit, and a business can give it to the nonprofit. And even if we could get a few percent of some organizations' revenue going into those entities, it could be good. So I think people learn the wrong things from We sometimes, but there was a lot there to learn, about. One of the issues was treatment of employees, and that's gotten a lot of attention, and that's good because I think that the charity sector, for all its talk about social justice and helping people, sometimes the people they take advantage of are volunteers and employees that are working in their own organizations. So, so it was amazing also to see. I've never seen anything like it. So many journalists covering a charity and it lasting for so long. I thought this would be an issue that'd be gone in a week. But it was interesting. And now we have a whole cadre of journalists who are quite knowledgeable about charities, much more than they were before. And I think that it is resulting in and will result in more coverage of the charity sector, and not the puff pieces about how wonderful the gala dinner was and which celebrities were there, but real questions around, some organizations and how they operate and the lack of transparency and things like that. So yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to remember back because that's so long ago, the beginning of that scandal. And to the credit of the Liberals, they did cancel the program really quickly. That's good. But how it ever could have gotten as far as it was is a monumental mistake. And that's from someone who approves of a lot of the things the Liberals did during the COVID situation. So.
Well, it's interesting. There was the political scandal, of course, and then the separate scandal, which was the actual when when one took a second look at how the charity was being run vis-a-vis its social enterprise uh, entities that were related to the charity, and the money that flowed back and forth, and then the transparency and the governance issues around board knowledge of what was going on in terms of the financials. Isn't that the other big scandal that emerged from this?
Right. So I've sort of, I think, divided it into three. One is the political one, which of course people in Ottawa are pretty fixated on. But, there's the issue of we itself as an organization, and then also the particulars of the program the government wanted implemented, which is problematic in many cases. What is a volunteer? Is a particular thing. You can't just call someone a volunteer and pay them $5,000 for something. Okay. And so it just was very problematic. It was problematic from a employment law, minimum standards type perspective. It was problematic in that depending on the amount of money that we actually put out, this 543, what is it, $543 million program, if less money was given out, in fact, we might have gotten paid as much as the money that was given out. So if it was, because not everyone was going to receive the 5,000. If everyone received the 1,000, we was going to make more money off this program than the program was actually giving out. And so there was just the way it was constructed. And I'm not saying that was we that constructed it, because I think we had a different program they had suggested. This was people within government saying this is what they want. And I think, there'll be other people writing about it, and political scientists and whatever looking at it. And it calls into question a major government department that does a lot of funding of the charity sector, and whether it's, shall we say, as the British say, fit for purpose. And then even more importantly, when people are saying that this should be the center of the charity sector, that the charity sector maybe should be placed in, ESDC or in any particular government department, I start to get very worried. Even though I thought that was a good idea a few years ago, I get worried because I think, what happens if there's a minister who doesn't really care or has a view that's antithetical to the charity sector, which could happen? And then you're stuck. You have to be in this one place. Right now, charities can contact any government department and, talk to them and do what they need to do. But if you have one home in government, you might end up with a situation where they just simply, every government department says, oh, well, please go to the home in government. Thank you. And that's a convenient excuse for people not to talk to charities. And then that home in government could be good or not good. So there's a lot of concerns with that, what seems like a little proposal. But when you look at how could they decide that all this money was going to be invested in the charity sector in one charity, that's crazy. And then, it says something about the department. And, the other thing was the government continued to fund charities during COVID. That's good. They didn't do cutbacks and stuff, but there was very little special funding of the charity sector. The, United Way's, Canadian Red Cross, community foundations got some money. But other than that, really, there wasn't that much. And a lot of it, I think, comes down to the charity sector's leadership is very weak. And also, I don't think governments take the charity sector seriously. So I think governments are very happy with the leadership of the charity sector. They like it. They don't deal with it like the Canadian Federation of Independent Business when they make suggestions. It gets a lot of play. So they love the leadership that's weak, and they can just ignore it and just go on and do their own stuff. But the charity sector is happy to have a weak leadership. They seem to be okay with that. So then, you don't get the extra funding and you don't get the other stuff. Look at the airlines. I mean, just airlines, how much money they get, and all these other groups that are getting money, and the charity sector sitting on the sidelines getting nothing, even though it's on the front lines of dealing with COVID and all that stuff. And now, obviously, some hospitals were getting money and all that, but I'm talking just the whole charity sector is on the front lines of a lot of the stuff and not getting any real funding for it extra from the government. So I think there's some lessons to be learned there that are beyond that. And also, the conflicts that some organizations have, because some organizations that are umbrella organizations also are trying to get money for things. So, one organization was actually involved with the We Charity program. And so that created some complexity there as well. I think that, the charity sector needs to sort of think in a strategic way about what type of representation does it want and how seriously does it want to be taken. And if we also put forward proposals that are not good proposals and things like that, then we can expect to be not having any traction with the governments. So this is it's a constant challenge. The reality is most people in the charity sector are not that interested in all the public policy issues relating to governance of the charity sector. So what it ends up is that a small group of people, maybe 50 or 100 or 200, that is really interested in that area, just basically does what they want, and then government just looks at it, laughs, and basically moves on, and doesn't do anything about the issues or anything. So hopefully there'll be some improvements in the future on that front.
Well, I think your comments around the home and government kind of movement that is I'm hearing about is really fascinating, because you've identified something that is, I think, a vulnerability that hasn't often been addressed by those that are proponents of having a home in government. Is it wise to have all your eggs in one basket, and having that power in one individual who may or may not be a strong supporter of the nonprofit and charitable sector? It's actually really something very interesting. I hadn't actually put my mind to that.
Yeah, and as I said, I was a supporter of the idea, a few years back, but I have seen what has happened in the UK and in Australia in terms of some of the stuff, and I have a lot of worries because it's amazing how just changing one person at the top can, whether it's a charity commission, whether it's some sort of ministry, you change one person, and all of a sudden the whole tenor of the whole thing can change, the direction can change. And also, anything done by government tends to have some real costs. I'm a big fan, by the way, of government getting involved. If you want to get 1 million people out of poverty, government is the best way to do it. But if you want to do certain tasks discreetly, sometimes government is not the best way to do it. And coordinating things, it's just very expensive. And so, I could easily see it costing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And, in government, you don't bat an eye at things like that. And I'm thinking to myself, I could think of a lot of things that could be done that'd be very positive for tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So I think we have to realize there's going to be a big cost. It will be a system that will have some lack of flexibility, let's just say. It'll be what it is. And it's going to be very much dependent on who's there. And so the risk of having it, I think, is greater than the not having it. And I find it interesting. All these people are saying, we want a home in government. And yet they're not sure where that home is going to be. What happens if they say it's Department of National Defense? Are you going to be happy with that? I mean, maybe that's good. It'll be good for some groups that deal with disasters, right? But you get what I'm saying? Like, people are just running like lemmings off a cliff. They're not actually thinking through the stuff. But, so what will happen is we'll have a situation. I mean, I love the Australian Charity Commission. Then they brought on a head who is a very controversial, far-right sort of guy. And it changes the whole tenor of the thing. And so anyway, I hope we don't have to deal with it. But if there is a home in government, which home will it be? And is it going to be a comfortable home for the charity sector? And I certainly hope, if it happens, that it's successful. But I am worried that it probably will not be successful, looking at some of the other countries and how it's worked out.